Some quite encouraging news if you think that some scientific institutions are not quite as trustworthy as you'd like, or if you're a farmer and you're tired of being accused of being an environmental desecrator by institutions who seem to be environmental activists. I think I might have found a hero politician who quietly pushes back on this flawed science. Now, nobody argues that proper science is wonderful, but a growing number of us realise that sometimes what we're told is proper science actually is nothing of the sort. Some aspects of climate science, my hobby horse on the Great Barrier Reef, and now it would seem quite a lot of nutritional information was wrong. Now carbohydrates are bad and fat is good or something like that. But you've got to remember that it's very hard for politicians to come out and say that they have reservations, even mild reservations about some of this science. They could have been accused of being not following the science. And science institutions all employ a lot of media people, and you don't want to get on the wrong side of them. You certainly don't want to walk down a dark alley with a science institution there. They could kneecap you at any time if you're a politician. And of course, I've been wittering on for quite a long time that governments need to start this science checking. I've been saying that for a decade or more. Now, sometimes I get very frustrated, but I'm going to give a very recent example, just last week, in fact, where I think that some of the politicians, or at least one of the politicians, is actually getting it. Well, almost getting it. Now, the example is the Primary Industries Minister from Queensland, Tony Perrott, and the topic is fisheries. Now, I mentioned in my last video that successive Labor governments have absolutely smashed the fishing industry, mostly on dodgy or non-existent science. And at risk of repeating myself, the closure of the Gulf of Carpentaria gill net fishery to save the Great Barrier Reef was one of the craziest decisions of any government ever, and based on absolute zero science. But there have been many others. So along comes Tony Perrott, and he's kind of talking my language about science integrity and dipping his toe into science checking, science updating, science auditing, call it what you like, or just actually doing the science or getting the science done that should have been done in the first place. So last week, for example, his department made an announcement about the scallop fishery here in Queensland, which had been virtually closed down by the previous government, supposedly because the fishery was in the last legs. So let's have a look at the announcement, and the language is important. So media release, blah, 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 Christopher government leads the way in science-backed strategy to rebuild the saucer scallop stocks. The scallop rebuilding strategy delivers, etc. Commitment for scientifically based decision making and casts aside an ideologically driven approach. I really like the way he's pushing that science thing, but there's more. Now, before we go on, I should say my mates in the fishing industry are questioning if the minister actually got it right on the southern part of that fishery, which he's not reopening yet, but I'll give him the benefit of the doubt at the moment. But this is actually the third time the minister has been challenging or checking the science on fishing. The second occasion was last year when he closed down a fishery. Yes, you heard me right there, he closed it down. But let's look. This was the gill net fishing in the southern coast of Queensland. It's a very, very small fishery. But again, let's look at the language. The former Labor government caught out making decisions on science management yet again without science. Dead right. Christopher government is delivering on its election commitment to ensure any fisheries regulated changes are backed by science. Southeast Queensland had no scientific basis, and it goes on. Regulation change backed by science. The former Labor Party minister, Mark Furner, had absolutely no scientific basis when he closed the gill net fishing. Labor made decisions without scientific, etc. You get the idea. Entirely based on ideology with no scientific basis. So what we're seeing here is a real commitment to looking at the science. Now, I won't go into whether I think he was right to then close this fishery, but at least he's talking the right language about science checking. Now, the first occasion that Minister Perrott had started to question the science was the Spanish Mackerel fishery, which was previously almost closed down by the previous government on science, which was just really utterly ridiculous. The science claimed that the fish stock levels were down to a tiny fraction of what they were at British settlement, but it was based on data which was just essentially made up, supposedly going all the way back to the First World War, which was ridiculous. And there was also a model, a mathematical model, which had some very, very unrealistic assumptions. And well, Minister Perrott commissioned what was, for all intents and purposes, amounted to a scientific audit, just like I've been saying. And let's have a look at the language of the statements, right? So new science-based Spanish mackerel stock assessment, evaluation has attracted significant industry and expert criticism. Stock assessment, the first conducted since the Christopher government overhaul, flawed processes. And that's right, actually. The processes are flawed because they're not actually doing audits. If we go on, it says science a few times, but then right at the end, gone are the days of Labor's botched stock assessment that relied on flawed science and were subject of industry criticism. Now, this is entirely right. So 3 examples of science checking. Now, of the 3, he increased in fisheries by fishing in 1, only by a little bit, but it was an increase. He increased and decreased, depending on the exact locations, in the 2nd. And in 1 where there was no science at all, he stopped fishing. Now, I'm not going to go on and talk about whether I agree with those decisions, because I'm actually interested in the scientific checking side of these things. And the question is, how much blowback did he get for checking the science? And the answer is none, which is extremely encouraging. But that's not all. I've been asking for science checking by a new organisation in Queensland called the Queensland Productivity Commission, started by the Christopher government. I even gave evidence at a parliamentary committee on that a year or 2 ago. And this is what Minister Perrott said about science checking within the Queensland Productivity Commission. And I quote from an article, Gympie MP and Primary Industries Minister Tony Parrott backed up new laws to establish the Independent Productivity Commission, which he says will be asked to investigate environmental restrictions and allegedly flawed scientific advice in some cases. Alleluia. Flawed scientific advice. He gets it. He wants to check it. And I have to say that, well, so far they haven't done any checking within the Queensland Productivity Commission, which is a bit of a disappointment. You'll hear more about that from me and perhaps some others in the near future. But okay, where does this actually leave us? Well, basically it shows that the strategy is good and it can be extended to other, I have to say, more important industries like scallop and Spanish mackerel are good, but beef, sugar and coal are far more important, and there's a lot of dodgy science or non-existent science there. So I have a suggestion for Mr. Perrott. We have a polite request. Mr. Perrott, you've talked about there being no science behind gill net fishing in southern Queensland. What about the fact there was absolutely no science behind the listing of the Mary and Burnett rivers as reef catchments, which means that every farm in those catchments is subject to unfair regulations being placed on them, which could be easily blown up if Labor gets back in another 4 or 8 years or whatever? Why can't we have an audit on the total lack of science behind the huge Bundaberg agricultural area being gazetted as effectively Great Barrier Reef killers? Even a cursory glance at that issue tells you that the Bundaberg region is having 0 impact. But I don't want to prejudge. Do a checking on the science. So the Minister has done some great small-scale trials on science checking, and you found it wanting 3 times out of 3. Let's scale it up a bit. Take on a significant agricultural example. The Burnett River Bundaberg agricultural area. I think that's a pretty fair request, actually.